Imagine this: Darth Vader reaches up and removes his helmet, not because he's dying, not because the Emperor is watching, not because the life support system is failing, but because he chooses to. And suddenly, everything you thought you knew about stalwarts fractures. This isn't a broken machine clinging to survival. This isn't a man imprisoned by wires and respirators. This is a man who wakes up every single morning and decides whether to be human or monster. In our timeline, Mustafar destroyed him. The lava didn't just burn flesh, it rewrote him. It reduced Anakin Skywalker to a body that could only survive inside steel and circuitry. Every breath mechanical, every movement assisted, every moment a reminder of what he lost. The suit wasn't just armor, it was a coffin he walked around in. But imagine a different outcome. Imagine that after Mustafar, the Emperor saved him completely. Advanced Sith alchemy, regenerative Bacta beyond, Republic science, ancient techniques buried and forgotten. Holocrons, Anakin survives, scarred, marked, changed, but whole. His lungs heal, his limbs are restored with seamless bio-engineering. His body functions on its own. The suit, it becomes optional, and that changes everything. Because now the mask is no longer a prison, it's a decision. Every morning, he stands before a mirror in his private chambers. The galaxy's most feared enforcer, staring back at a man. The scars are still there, thin, pale rivers across his face. The eyes still burn faintly gold when anger rises, but he can breathe on his own, slow, steady, human. And on the table beside him rests the helmet. Some days, he stares at it for a long time, because putting it on isn't about survival anymore, it's about identity. Does he want to be Darth Vader today, or does he want to remember he was Anakin Skywalker? That daily choice becomes more torturous than any life support system ever was. In the original timeline, the suit forced distance between him and everyone else. The mechanical breathing announced his presence before he even entered a room. Officers feared the machine, but in this version, he could walk into an Imperial meeting in nothing but black robes. No breathing, no distortion, just silence. And a face. Imagine the psychological warfare. The fear becomes quieter, more intimate, more unsettling, because now they aren't afraid of a monster behind a mask, they're afraid of a man who chooses to wear one. And what happens when he meets Luke? In our timeline, Luke meets a machine first. The humanity is hidden, but here, their first encounter could be face to face. A father looking at his son with uncovered eyes. Does that make redemption easier or harder? Because now, evil isn't something forced on him by pain and survival. It's something he actively embraces every day. The ultimate tragedy of Darth Vader was always that he felt trapped. But what if he wasn't trapped at all? What if the mask was never necessary? What if it was? Comfort, a shield from guilt, a barrier against memory, a way to avoid seeing Padme's reflection in his own scars. If he can remove the helmet whenever he wants, then every moment he chooses to wear it becomes a confession. Not, I have to be this, but I choose to be this. And that makes the story darker, more complex, more devastating, because redemption isn't about escaping a prison, it's about willingly stepping out of one. And if Vader could remove his helmet at any time, then the real question isn't whether he can be saved, it's whether he ever truly wanted to be. Consider the morning routine of this alternate Vader. He wakes in his private chambers aboard his superstar destroyer. The medical bay attached to his quarters contains the regeneration equipment that maintains his restored health. But he doesn't need it to survive. As he prepares for the day, he stands before a mirror that shows him his actual face. The scars from Mustafar are still visible, pale lines across his features that serve as permanent reminders of his fall. His eyes might still carry the yellow tinge of the dark side, or perhaps they flicker between the Sith yellow and his original blue, depending on his emotional state. The helmet sits on its stand across the room. Some days, the weight of command and the needs of the Empire would make the choice easy. Imperial officers expect to see the mechanical Dark Lord, and the psychological effect of the helmet on both allies and enemies is undeniable. But other days, the helmet might feel like a burden, a costume he's grown tired of wearing. The political ramifications within the Empire would be staggering and far-reaching. Imperial propaganda had carefully crafted Darth Vader into this mythic figure. This implacable force of the Emperor's will. The helmet was central to this mythology. It made him seem inhuman, unstoppable, more force of nature than person. But what happens when your mythic enforcer can reveal himself to be fundamentally human? The Imperial hierarchy would react in complex and contradictory ways. Some officers might lose their fear-based respect if they saw Vader's human face. The mystique that made him so terrifying was partially based on the unknown, the alien quality of his mechanical appearance. Seeing him as recognizably human might make him seem more approachable, more fallible, less godlike in his authority. However, other Imperial officers might develop an even deeper loyalty, seeing him as someone who chooses to be terrifying rather than someone who has no choice in the matter. The psychological impact of a leader who voluntarily becomes a monster is potentially more frightening than one who was forced into it. It suggests a level of commitment to the Imperial cause that goes beyond mere circumstance. Regional governors would react differently, based on their own personalities and political positions. Those who had risen through political maneuvering rather than military service might see a helmeted Vader as more legitimate, more in line with Imperial imagery. Others, particularly former Republic military officers who remembered the Clone Wars, might prefer to see the human face, as it would remind them of the hero Anakin Skywalker had once been. The Imperial Navy would have its own complex relationship with this choice. Admiral Pite and other high-ranking officers would need to navigate the uncertainty of never knowing which version of Vader they would encounter. This unpredictability could actually be more effective than consistent intimidation. Predictable fear becomes manageable over time, but unpredictable humanity mixed with the potential for mechanical terror that keeps everyone off balance, constantly guessing, never quite comfortable. Emperor Palpatine himself would face a unique challenge with this version of his apprentice. In the original timeline, Vader's dependence on his life support made him controllable to some degree. The Emperor held the ultimate power over his apprentices, very breathing, literally controlling his life support systems if necessary. But a Vader who didn't need the suit, that's a Vader who's much harder to control, much more dangerous as a potential rival. The Emperor's relationship with this Vader would be fundamentally different. Palpatine might actually prefer this version in some ways. A healthy Vader would be more powerful in the Force, more capable in combat, more effective as an enforcer of Imperial will across the galaxy. His physical capabilities wouldn't be limited by the bulky life support systems, making him a more formidable opponent against Jedi survivors and rebel forces. But Palpatine would also be more wary of this version. A Vader who wasn't dependent on technology for survival would be much more capable of independent action. The psychological leash that the life support provided would be gone, replaced by the much more tenuous bonds of ideology and shared purpose. This Vader could potentially challenge Palpatine much more effectively, and the Emperor would need to rely more heavily on manipulation and political control rather than physical dependency. The dynamics of their master-apprentice relationship would shift dramatically. Instead of Palpatine maintaining control through Vader's medical dependency, he would need to focus on psychological and political manipulation. This might actually make their relationship more traditionally Sith-like, with the apprentice genuinely capable of overthrowing the master when the time came. Rather than being held back by physical limitations, the broader Imperial court would also react in complex ways. Grand Moffs, like Tarkin, who had worked with Anakin Skywalker during the Clone Wars, might have conflicted feelings about seeing their colleague's face again. Some might feel nostalgic for the hero he had once been, while others might be disturbed by the transformation they witnessed. The Imperial Guard would face unique challenges as well. Their duty was to protect the Emperor, but their relationship with Vader had always been complicated by his position as both ally and potential threat. A Vader who was physically more capable and less dependent on technology would require different security considerations and protocols. Consider how this would affect Imperial military strategy on a galactic scale. Officers who had to report to Vader would never know which version they were facing on any given day. Are they reporting to the mechanical Dark Lord, whose breathing alone could terrify a room into submission? Or are they facing the scarred but human face of a man who chose to become a monster? This uncertainty could actually be more effective than consistent. intimidation in maintaining discipline and loyalty. The Rebel Alliance would also react very differently to this version of Vader, and their intelligence networks would struggle to create a coherent profile of their enemy. Intelligence reports describing him would be contradictory and confusing. Some encounters would describe the familiar black-armored enforcer with the mechanical breathing that had become legendary. Across the galaxy, others would report a figure in dark robes with a human face bearing the scars of unimaginable trauma. This contradiction would make him harder to understand, harder to predict, and potentially much harder to defeat. The rebellion fought against the Empire partly because it represented the cold, mechanical oppression of freedom and individuality. But how do you maintain that narrative when your enemy's greatest enforcer can literally choose between man and machine? How do you demonize someone who sometimes appears recognizably human? Rebel propaganda would struggle with this complexity. It's much easier to paint a mechanical monster as the enemy of freedom than it is to explain the nuanced evil of someone who chooses to appear monstrous. The simple narrative of good versus evil becomes more complicated when evil has a human face that it willingly shows and hides. The intelligence value of this unpredictability would be enormous for the Empire. Rebel spies would provide conflicting reports, making it difficult for Alliance leadership to develop effective counter-strategies. Some agents might report that Vader was becoming more human, potentially more sympathetic to their cause. Others would report that his ability to appear human made him even more dangerous and manipulative. The most significant changes, however, would be in Vader's personal relationships, particularly with his children. The revelation of Luke Skywalker's existence and their subsequent encounters would unfold in dramatically different ways. Imagine the first confrontation between Luke and Vader in our alternate timeline. Luke extends his lightsaber ready to face the mechanical monster he's heard described in whispered terror across the galaxy. But instead of the expected black mask, he finds himself facing a scarred human face. Still intimidating, still radiating dark side power, but undeniably human. The psychological impact of this encounter would be completely different. Luke had prepared himself to face a machine, a force of evil so removed from humanity that it could be fought without reservation. But seeing a human face, even one twisted by the dark side and marked by terrible scars, would introduce doubt and complexity that the original timeline never provided. The revelation of their relationship would hit completely differently as well. Instead of the shocking moment of mechanical breathing stopping as Vader speaks Luke's name, we might have a scene where Vader slowly, deliberately removes his helmet to reveal his identity. The gesture would be loaded with meaning. Here is my true face. Here is who I really am, beneath the legend and the fear. The psychological impact on Luke would be immense. It's one thing to learn that the mechanical Dark Lord is your father. There's almost an abstract quality to that revelation, a sense that your father has become something so removed from humanity that the familial connection is more symbolic than real. But it's another thing entirely to see the human face of the man who made that choice, to see the features that might echo your own, to recognize the person beneath the monster. Luke's entire character development might accelerate as a result. Seeing his father's humanity from the beginning, even corrupted and scarred, might make the possibility of redemption seem more real, more achievable. The abstract concept of saving Darth Vader becomes the concrete goal of saving the scarred man whose face he can see. Alternatively, it might make the betrayal feel more personal and devastating. It's easier to forgive a faceless machine than it is to forgive a person who looks you in the eye and chooses evil. Luke might struggle more with anger and hatred, seeing his father's deliberate choices written across his human features. The training sequences with Yoda would take on different meanings as well. Yoda's warnings about anger and hatred would be more immediate and personal. Luke wouldn't be struggling with abstract concepts of good and evil, but with the very concrete reality of his father's human face choosing darkness. The cave vision on Dagobah might show Luke his own face beneath Vader's helmet, but the impact would be different if Vader's helmet was a choice rather than a necessity. Leia's story would change dramatically as well. With the potential for Vader to appear without his helmet, there's a real possibility she might recognize family resemblance much earlier in the timeline. The Force connections between family members are strong. but visual recognition could trigger those connections sooner and more powerfully. Imagine a scenario where Leia, captured aboard a Star Destroyer, is brought before Vader without his helmet. She sees something familiar in his scarred features, some echo of the mother she never knew or the hint of features she shares. The recognition might not be immediate or conscious, but it could plant seeds of doubt and confusion that would affect her interactions with him from that point forward. The political implications of Leia recognizing Vader as her father would be staggering. As a leader of the Rebel Alliance, she would be forced to confront the reality that she was fighting against her own biological father. The personal stakes of the galactic civil war would become impossibly complex. How do you lead a rebellion against an empire when your father is one of its primary enforcers? The psychological trauma would be different as well. In the original timeline, Leia learned about her parentage after Vader's death and redemption, when she could process it as a tragic but resolved piece of family history. But learning it while the conflict was ongoing, while seeing his human face making evil choices, would be devastating in entirely different ways. But perhaps the most emotionally devastating change would be in any potential encounter with Tano in the original timeline. Ahsoka's confrontation with Vader in Rebels was heartbreaking, partly because she had to see through the mechanical exterior to recognize her former master. The helmet and breathing apparatus created a barrier that made the recognition gradual and painful. But imagine if Vader had chosen to remove his helmet during their duel. Imagine Ahsoka seeing Anakin's face, scarred and aged and filled with a dark side, but still recognizably the man who had been like a brother to her. The emotional weight of that revelation would be almost unbearable. The recognition would be immediate and devastating. There would be no gradual realization, no piecing together of clues, just the stark reality of seeing her former master's face. Twisted by hatred and dark side corruption, Ahsoka's reaction would be different too. Instead of the slow, painful acceptance we saw in the original timeline, she might react with immediate anger, betrayal, and grief. The dialogue between them would be more personal, more cutting. Ahsoka could look into his eyes and see the person she once knew, making her accusations and disappointments more direct and painful. Vader, in turn, would be forced to confront his past more directly, unable to hide behind the mechanical facade that had allowed him to compartmentalize his previous identity. Combat scenarios throughout the saga would also change significantly. The practical advantages of being able to remove the helmet are substantial and would affect every lightsaber duel and military engagement. Better peripheral vision would make Vader more aware of his surroundings, able to track multiple opponents more effectively. Improved hearing would allow him to detect subtle audio cues that the helmet's audio systems might miss or distort. More natural breathing during intense physical activity would increase his endurance and stamina. The original Vader's breathing was regulated by his life support systems, which might not have been optimized for the variable demands of lightsaber combat. A Vader who could breathe naturally would be able to sustain intense physical activity for longer periods without the limitations of mechanical respiratory assistance. However, there would be significant trade-offs that would make combat more complex and interesting. The helmet provided substantial protection against both lightsaber strikes and environmental hazards. A helmetless Vader would be more vulnerable to attacks targeting his head and face. Skilled opponents might be able to exploit this vulnerability, forcing him to be more defensive in his fighting style. The intimidation factor would also be reduced in some circumstances. There's something deeply unsettling about fighting an opponent whose face you can't see, whose breathing is mechanical and rhythmic, whose expressions are completely hidden. A human face, even a scarred and intimidating one, is still human. Can show pain, fatigue, emotion, doubt. These tells could potentially be exploited by skilled opponents who knew how to read facial expressions and body language. The psychological warfare aspects would become incredibly complex. Vader might choose to fight some opponents while helmeted to maintain. Strategic considerations during major battles would be dramatically different. In the original timeline, Vader's need for his life support systems created vulnerabilities that could theoretically be exploited. Electrical attacks, electromagnetic pulses, or damage to specific system components could potentially disable or kill him. But a Vader who chose to wear the armor rather than needing it would be much harder to disable through technical means. This version of Vader would also be more adaptable to different environmental conditions. The original required specific atmospheric conditions and could be vulnerable to certain types of environmental hazards, extreme cold, heat, or atmospheric compositions that would overwhelm his life support systems could limit his effectiveness. But a Vader who could remove his helmet and breathe naturally would be much more versatile in different combat environments. Underwater combat, for instance, would be possible with appropriate equipment rather than being completely impossible. Due to life support limitations, high-altitude environments, toxic atmospheres with proper protection, extreme temperature variations, all of these would become manageable rather than potentially fatal. The broader implications for the Force itself are fascinating to consider and would ripple throughout the entire galactic conflict. In the original timeline, Vader's physical limitations may have actually constrained his Force potential. While pain and suffering can fuel the dark side, physical limitations and dependency can also limit the full expression of Force abilities. A healthier Vader might be capable of Force techniques we never saw in the original timeline. His telekinetic abilities might be stronger without the energy drain of life support systems. His precognition and battle meditation might be clearer without the constant background noise of mechanical breathing and system monitoring. His ability to influence minds might be more subtle and effective without the intimidating but limiting mechanical presence. But there's a deeper philosophical question about the nature of the Force and how it interacts with physical and emotional states. Part of Vader's connection to the dark side was driven by his constant physical pain and his rage at his limitations. A Vader who was healed, who wasn't constantly confronting his own mortality and dependency, might have a fundamentally different relationship with the Force. Would this version of Vader be more or less committed to the Sith path? The answer is complex and would depend heavily on his psychological development. On one hand, he wouldn't have the constant physical reminders of his fall, driving him deeper into darkness. The rage and hatred that fueled his dark side powers wouldn't be constantly reinforced by physical pain and limitation. On the other hand, knowing that he chose to become what he was, that he wasn't forced into it by irreversible physical damage, might make him more committed to that choice. There would be a psychological weight to owning his transformation completely, without the excuse of medical necessity. The daily choice of wearing or removing the helmet would become a meditation on his identity and commitment to the dark side. Each time he put on the helmet, he would be consciously choosing to embrace the Vader persona. Each time he removed it, he would be confronting the reality of who he had become and why. This constant self-examination might actually make him more dangerous as a Sith. Instead of being driven by unconscious rage and pain, his dark side connection would be more deliberate and focused. He would understand his motivations more clearly, making his actions more calculated and effective. The training of any potential apprentices would also be different. A Vader who had conscious control over his identity and appearance could be a more effective teacher. He could demonstrate the choice between light and dark side, literally showing apprentices the difference between the man and the monster. This visual metaphor would be incredibly powerful for Sith training. The redemption arc that we see in Return of the Jedi would unfold in completely different ways, with implications that would redefine the entire emotional core of the Star Wars saga. Luke's entire strategy for saving his father was based on appealing to the humanity buried beneath the mechanical exterior. He believed that Anakin Skywalker still existed somewhere inside the machine, that the good man could be reached, despite the layers of technology and dark side corruption. But what if that humanity was always visible? What if the struggle between Anakin and Vader was written across his scarred features for anyone to see? Luke might be more hopeful about the possibility of redemption, seeing his father's human face and recognizing the man beneath the monster. But he might also be more disappointed and angry when that human face continues to make evil choices. It's psychologically easier to forgive someone who is forced into darkness by circumstance than someone who actively chooses it every day. The original Vader could be seen as a victim of his own poor choices and Palpatine's manipulation, someone who was trapped by forces beyond his control. But this alternate Vader would bear full responsibility for his actions, in a way that the original never did. The conversations between Luke and Vader would be more direct and personal. Instead of speaking to a mechanical mask, Luke would be looking into his father's eyes, seeing the emotions and conflicts playing across his features. The helmet had provided a barrier that allowed both characters to maintain some emotional distance. Without it, their interactions would be more raw and immediate. Luke's anger might be more pronounced as well, seeing his father's human face choosing evil, seeing the deliberate nature of his dark side commitment, might make Luke's own struggles with anger and hatred more intense. The temptation to strike down his father in anger might be stronger because the evil would be more personal and visible. The final confrontation with Emperor Palpatine would be dramatically different and would require a complete reimagining of the climactic scenes of Return of the Jedi. In the original timeline, the moment when Vader removes his helmet for Luke is incredibly powerful, partly because it's the first time we see his humanity fully revealed. The physical act of removing the helmet becomes symbolic of his return to the light side. But in our alternate scenario, that revelation would have happened much earlier in their relationship. The climactic moment would need different symbolism to carry the same emotional weight. Instead, the pivotal moment might be Vader choosing to put the helmet back on one final time, embracing the Vader persona completely to gather the strength needed to destroy his master. Or perhaps the opposite would be more powerful, him removing the helmet defiantly in front of Palpatine, choosing to face his master as Anakin Skywalker rather than as his Sith apprentice. The symbolic weight of that choice, helmet on or off, would carry the entire emotional climax of the saga. The Emperor's reaction would be different as well. Palpatine had grown accustomed to dealing with the mechanical Vader, someone whose emotions were filtered through life support systems and whose humanity was largely hidden. Facing the raw emotions and visible humanity of his apprentice would require different manipulation techniques. Palpatine might actually be more effective at manipulation. If he could see Vader's facial expressions and emotional reactions directly, the ability to read his apprentice's face would provide valuable information for psychological manipulation. But it might also make Vader's eventual rebellion more obvious and harder to prevent. From a broader storytelling perspective, this alternate version of Vader would be incredibly complex and would challenge audiences in ways that the original character never did. He'd be simultaneously more and less sympathetic than the original Vader. More sympathetic because his humanity would always be visible, because audiences could see the man beneath the monster. Less sympathetic because his evil actions would clearly be conscious choices rather than the result of being trapped in a mechanical prison. The visual storytelling opportunities would be remarkable and would revolutionize how the character is portrayed in film. Directors could use the helmet as a visual metaphor throughout the saga. Scenes where Vader chooses to wear it could show his embrace of the dark side or his retreat from emotional vulnerability. Moments where he removes it could hint at internal conflict, the possibility of redemption, or his willingness to confront his true self. The lighting and cinematography around these choices would become crucial storytelling elements. The act of putting on or removing the helmet could be filmed to emphasize different emotions: defiance, shame, anger, hope, despair. The helmet could become a visual representation of his internal state, with audiences learning to read his psychological condition based on his choice to wear it or not. Imagine the marketing and cultural implications as well. The Vader helmet is one of the most iconic designs in cinema history, instantly recognizable around the world. But in this alternate timeline, it would represent something entirely different. Instead of being a prison or a life support necessity, it would represent choice, agency, and the conscious decision to embrace or reject one's humanity. The merchandise, the cultural impact, the way children play with Vader toys, all of it would be fundamentally different if the helmet represented choice rather than necessity. The character would become a more complex symbol in popular culture, representing the daily choices we all make between the family structures and child-rearing practices would be fundamentally altered as well. How do you raise children when their understanding of identity and appearance is so fluid? New parenting strategies would need to emerge around helping children develop healthy relationships with their own identity and presentation. The coming-of-age rituals and traditions would need to be completely reconsidered. Instead of marking the transition from childhood to adulthood, Such ceremonies might focus on the moment when young beings gain the ability or right to consciously choose their identity and appearance. The historical record-keeping and documentation practices would face massive challenges. How do you maintain accurate historical records when key figures might appear completely different in different contexts? New methods of documentation would need to be developed that could account for identity, fluidity. The artistic and creative communities would experience a renaissance of possibility. Visual artists might explore themes of identity and transformation in entirely new ways. Musicians might compose works that captured the emotional complexity of chosen identity. Writers would have new narrative possibilities around characters, whose appearance could change at will. But these same communities might also struggle with questions of authenticity and artistic truth. If anyone could appear as anyone else, what would that mean for portrait painting or biographical writing? New artistic movements might emerge around these questions of identity and representation. The sporting and competitive communities would need to completely reconsider their rules and standards. If physical limitations could be overcome through medical intervention, how would fair competition be maintained? New categories and classifications might be needed to account for varying levels of medical enhancement. The dating and relationship dynamics throughout the galaxy would be transformed beyond recognition. How do you form romantic attachments when your partner's appearance might be consciously chosen rather than naturally determined? New social norms would need to emerge around disclosure and authenticity in relationships. The very concept of physical attraction would need to be reconsidered. If appearance could be altered at will, would attraction be based on someone's current presentation or their underlying genetic features? New forms of compatibility assessment might emerge that looked beyond surface appearance to deeper markers of identity. The aging process and life span considerations would be completely altered if physical appearance could be maintained or altered. At will, the entire concept of aging gracefully would be transformed. Some might choose to maintain a youthful appearance indefinitely, while others might embrace the visual markers of age and experience. The intergenerational relationships would face new complexities. How do you maintain family relationships when multiple generations might appear to be the same age? New social structures might emerge. Around non-visual markers of generational identity, the memorial and remembrance practices would need to be reconsidered as well. How do you memorialize someone whose appearance changed throughout their lifetime? Which version of their appearance becomes the canonical representation for historical purposes? The immigration and citizenship processes would face unprecedented challenges. If individuals could alter their appearance, how would planetary governments track movement and residency? New forms of identification and documentation would be essential. The insurance and risk assessment industries would need complete overhauls. If physical risks could be mitigated through advanced medical intervention, entire categories of insurance might become obsolete, while new ones would emerge around identity and appearance-related risks. In the final analysis, this single change to Vader's story would transform not just the Star Wars narrative, but the entire conceptual framework of identity, choice, and authenticity that underlies civilized society. The galaxy would become a place where the most fundamental questions of existence, who we are and how we choose to present ourselves, would be literally embodied in its most iconic character at every being in the galaxy, would be forced to confront their own assumptions about identity and appearance. Every institution would need to adapt to a reality where the most basic markers of individual identity could be consciously chosen rather than simply accepted. And in the center of it all would be Vader, no longer just a fallen hero or redeemed villain, but a living symbol of the power and responsibility that comes with the ability to choose who you are every day for the rest of your life. His story would become the galaxy's story, a meditation on choice, identity, and the eternal question of who we decide to become when given the power to be anything we want to be.